Welcome to the Generous Business Owner Podcast, where business owners gain inspiration and encouragement to live a legacy, not just leave one. And now your hosts, Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. My name is Jeff Thomas, and I've got my trusty co-host with me today, Jeff Rutt. Say hello to the people, Jeff.
Hello to the people.
Hello to the people. And we have a very special guest, Josh Kwan, with us. He is the CEO of The Gathering. And if that name sounds familiar, you're right. He is one of the elite returning guests we've had on the podcast, but we've all recently returned from kind of the signature event that The Gathering puts on. They move it around. It was in Austin this year. And we all had such a good time. We just wanted to share a few stories with you that we thought were meaningful, that you would enjoy if you didn't have the chance to make it, or even if you did and maybe you had other conversations. So with that, I was the rookie at the Gathering, so maybe I'll share a story or two down the road, but I'll turn it over to the veterans, starting with Jeff Rutt. Jeff, how many of these have you been to, and what were a few of the things that you were kind of highlights for you this year?
Yeah, so it's actually I've only been to 3, so okay. I don't know that qualifies me as a veteran. I've only been to 2. My daughter and her husband, Clark and Elisa Huber, have been to 3, and they were the ones that actually said, "Dad." They came back and said, "Dad, you have to come to this."
Nice.
But I've been hearing about it from, of course, Peter Greer has been telling me about it for probably 20 years. And so, Josh, thank you for leading so well. You bring your unique, your personality is definitely impacting the direction. I'd love you to talk a little bit about, I'd love to dig into how the baton of our faith, our values, the way we think about stewarding and generosity to the next generation and then the next generation. And you do such a great job of building the relationships, not only between different families that are on different stages of the journey, but also within families, from those generation to generation, children's children. So can you talk a little bit about the actually, maybe the importance of that and from your viewpoint, and then also what the Gathering is doing to kind of promote that and really put that in fertile soil?
Thank you, Jeff, and on behalf of me and my team for such kind words, both Jeffs. Because it's not just me working on this, but so many others. And, and we're all dads here. And so I think I would say that, obviously our kids are constantly watching us and how we behave, what we say, whether our behavior lines up with our words and whether those words line up with our faith, right? What we proclaim to be our faith. And so that happens 24/7. What I hope for the Gathering, and I think the reason people come to the Gathering, is that for this one long weekend a year, and then we have some other activities during the rest of the year, but for this one signature event, they have a chance to step outside of their home, outside of their normal rhythms, and have some intentional conversations, intentional experiences together as a family, as a nuclear family, as an extended family, and let those conversations be catalysts for deeper dialogue. Sometimes it's going to be a chance to revisit some themes throughout your year of parenting. And other times it's like, hey, actually, well, we just heard this family. What do you think about how this family handled this particular issue or crisis or major decision point in their lives? And that can be a catalytic moment for you to have a dialogue with your spouse or your child or your grandchildren and say, what do you think they did well? And what do you think would match well with our family values and our understanding of Scripture and our lives? And we're not saying that there are prescriptive approaches, but people at the Gathering are willing to be vulnerable and revealing in their stories, to invite other people to consider how they may follow that same path or maybe diverge and take a slightly different approach. Even though we share the same gospel, share the same love of Jesus, we have different sets of values and families of origin. And so we're going to have different decisions along the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So talk a little bit about, I love the fact that you really cater to that younger, the really young generation.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
and that's how actually Clark and Elisa ended up taking their young girls to the gathering and had such a great time. I know Elisa talks about the I like giving curriculum, and the girls came back talking about things that they learned
Mhm.
while their parents were learning. But talk a little bit about your focus on that gen.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. So we have a parallel program. We attract adults to come, and then they say, "Hey, you bring your kids." And for the parents, the initial attraction is like, "Hey, I can bring my kids and then drop them off in the morning and don't see them until late at night, and so I can like have focused conversation with other adults." That's great. But what we really want to do with the kids is our hope is that if you start bringing your kids at age 3, by the time they are 18, so we have a program from age 3 to 18, our hope is that they'll have developed friendships within this community, that they'll have experiences and conversations and about the fundamental virtues that underline our ability to steward wisely. How do you have a compassionate heart? How do you have a mindset for generosity? How do you see the way that Christ would see when he would encounter people that he loves in the streets or in need or are hurting or in pain? And so at a very young age, our kids actually see and feel that viscerally. And we try to provide some language. We try to open their imagination for the kind of resources they have. And it's not just mom and dad's wallet.
Mhm.
It's about how they can advocate for somebody or how they can join their kids or their friends to advocate or to raise money or to wear what they buy, what they consume, and where they give and how they can share the story with other family members. So yeah, so it has to be first of all, it has to be outrageously fun so that kids are entertained and they enjoy their experience. And then we weave in a chance for them to experience part of the dialogue that happens for the adults. And I'll just give one quick example from Austin. Um, so the adults got a chance to learn about the issue of homelessness and how do you move people from chronic homelessness into transitional housing, into housing that provides a wraparound services for people who are homeless and experiencing addiction or other challenges to stability. And they got to go to a dinner at this community of tiny homes, right, and meet neighbors and hear from experts in the field. For our kids are, we also got to bring them to the same neighborhood and they got to do gardening with some of the neighbors. And they got to share a meal together with the neighbors. And then at the end of the night, some of these kids were able to talk to their parents about, hey, what did you see? And who did you talk to? And how, what do we read in scriptures that may inform how we ought to love our neighbors? And what does it mean to love our neighbors?
Mhm.
Kids and adults are experiencing similar interactions and connections with nonprofit leaders and people who are benefiting from the nonprofit ministries, and then getting scripture and applying scripture to their lives. So that's what we're trying to do at the gathering across generations.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought it was not only yeah, outrageously fun and inspiring for the time that you were there, like the families were there and being able to share like experiences. And I was at that dinner at the community where they had the very holistic services for the homeless. And it was very powerful. But then it also what I saw was it inspired other ideas that these families can take home and say, you know what, I could apply this to my community or to my city or to something I'm doing, and that they're connected to, and I can do it as a family, and I can be aware of these opportunities, because so you're kind of taking opening some of the eyes of these families to do that. Well, Jeff, I'm going to kick it over to you, but
Yeah.
before I do, one other kind of one of the follow-ups that we had was with a family to your point where we're going to be our family, our kids are in their 30s, the grandkids are, 1 to 10. And we're trying to learn how other families have journeyed before us, the good, bad, and the ugly, right? What can we learn from others? I love benchmarking in our home building business. I love benchmarking. And at Hope International, I love benchmarking. We should all be learning from each other. And that's what I love about the gathering is folks are so open. But we were at a workshop, and there was so much good discussion. So we ended up following up, and we're gonna jump on a Zoom call and just learn from them about this next, passing on. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, as far as from your perspective, some of the best practices that are shared on, passing on that the mantle of, faith, values, and generosity.
Mm. Yeah, and that's probably strikes to one of our core our values that we have at the gathering, and what maybe makes us distinct, right? Is that it's a place where people and families can build friendships. They're on solid foundation of trust, right?
Mhm.
Without trust, you can't really share your challenges,
Mhm.
where you may have slipped up in the past, or maybe like things that are just pain points,
Mhm.
no fault of any individuals. It's like what happens when people have different opinions, right?
Yeah.
And different ways of thinking about the world, and
Mhm.
different passages of scripture that strike them as most essential. And so what happens when you have this conflict or disagreement or maybe even brokenness, right? And so we say, in order to learn, there are no, like there are experts, but there's only so much an expert can teach you without having actually been in your shoes, right?
Right.
Actually
Yes.
be a steward of wealth and have a family and try to raise them to love Jesus and have a healthy relationship with money and wealth and resources.
Mhm.
So we're like, okay, so none of us have done it perfectly well. All of us have something to learn and teach each
Yes.
other. And so the gathering, we're trying to create an environment in which you are safe and secure and trusted. We do that through, right, whether it's a breakout session or maybe a peer group that meets over Zoom. And then later in November, we're going to have a field trip, what we call an exploration trip. And the Hershin family is going to host us in Atlanta.
Mhm.
They run one of the largest family entertainment organizations, companies in the United States. They own a whole bunch of theme parks across the United States, including aquariums and the Harlem Globetrotters and Chuggington, the TV property. And they've said, hey, we are in our third generation of family ownership, now fourth, right? But the family that Chris and Ashley who are hosting us, they've said that they grew up in the gathering and they were the beneficiaries of other families who've opened up their stories to them. And as they were raising their kids and navigating, being an owner and working for the family business and all of that. And they said, how can we open our story for others to have a discussion? And so 16 gathering members are going to come to their home and have conversations about this very thing. And Jeff, some of the patterns, each family is uniquely
Yeah.
structured and
Yeah.
have different dynamics, but some of the core things that are universal are families that communicate well with one another,
Mhm.
families that have a clarity of structure and clarity of how decisions are made. There's this consistency to their family values and how they operate those family values. Those are just, uh, sometimes they're like, oh, that's so obvious, but it's so hard to do well, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I Jeff and I were talking before we started recording, and Josh too, a little bit about, when as I'm telling stories from being there, there are really so many great moments, but really one of the most impactful was actually the family that Jeff Rutt's talking about. We just happened to kind of have that in common of he's actually following up with them. But it
Mm.
was two, just to, not to give names, but it was two grandchildren, kind of in their, I would say, 40s.
Mhm.
And their grandfather had become a Christian when he was in his 80s, if I have the fact set right. And he was a wonderful guy, very successful financially, and had actually done a pretty good job. They felt like they weren't upset with him. They were just like pleased with the way he lived his life, especially after becoming a believer. And he had done some generous things for the family, but then also had created this family foundation. And these two grandchildren were in charge, and they were instructed. They were given some basic instructions, which were super helpful. They're very thankful for those basic instructions. And I don't even remember what they all were, but one of them was to include the rest of the family. Well, there's like 30 something family members. That's not an easy ask. Probably easier if you two just give it away, or I'll just give it away. I mean, those would have been easier, I suppose. but they just were really honest about the things that weren't revealed that they needed to know. And of course, if their grandfather had known what to reveal, he would have done it. And I think, Jeff, is it fair to say that that's kind of the stuff that you'd like to maybe get a list to make sure that you disclose to your family? Is that, Jeff, how you think about it?
Well, yeah, and I would love Josh to talk more about that. But yeah, I think it's just a great environment. Along the benchmarking, I think it was it Mark Twain that said, "Never let school get in the way of learning," something like that. And I just think sometimes we learn so much more from our peers than we do from going to a seminar where somebody has all the principles laid out on a PowerPoint.
Right. So, Josh, is that it seems like there is an intentional desire to have people really be vulnerable, as you've said, and how do you develop? How do you find those stories and that kind of thing to bring those to light?
Mm. You know, we are able to encourage vulnerability by modeling it. So we have leaders in the community who, on paper, you'd say, "Wow, they're so successful," and
Right.
right, they've achieved all this, right?
Mm.
And everyone wants to be known for that, but it is it's a little bit dangerous, right?
Yeah.
To expose yourself and say, well, that's the glossy version of the story, and I'll share the deeper version. And I'm willing to share the deeper version because I heard somebody else that I respect and admire be willing to do that in this community, knowing that it's not going to get out. And I know that somebody in this audience will benefit from, God will tell my story and benefit somebody else because of what he's done through me. And I had to mature in these ways. I had to have my, maybe a sinful nature, or maybe just like my struggle, that it wasn't a straight linear line, up and to the right. So yes, it's modeled and then it's honored, right? So we would say, hey, this is not a place to cast judgment. It's like, oh wow, Jeff did that. I mean, please, I would never do that, right? But it's to say, like, no, in the moment, Jeff made the best decision possible. He was on his knees and he tried, right? And then let's honor that. And then because he's willing to share that moment, I'm going to honor it and I'm going to say, okay, what might I learn from Jeff, and what might I be able to teach somebody else? And so it is a receive and then give.
Yeah.
So can I ask you a question, Jeff? I maybe just a slightly, and you can come back to that subject if you want, but a slightly different twist. Josh, we didn't talk about this before, so just give me the X sign if you don't want to talk about this. But there was three things that I heard that I thought were so like interesting in as a part of the gathering this year, and they were like frontline. Okay, there's a lot of a lot of discussion about the one was AI. The other was gaming, and the other one was I think the session was called moving pictures. Like what's happening with movies and faith-based movies and the Jesus film and just the industry in general. But maybe talk a little bit. I felt like all three of them were so well done, and just caused, at least for me and our family, just caused us to think more deeply about what are some of the ways these things can be used for good or evil, and some of the discussion that promoted.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. And I think most things around technology or media or like larger forces at work in society that are shaping society, um, sometimes we as Christians may be fearful about the ramifications or the long-term trends. And there are some reasons to be concerned if they're left unchecked,
Mhm.
or maybe there's an abdication of moral authority in those arenas.
Mhm.
And my hope is that the gathering invites those conversations with people who are, the very top leaders in their fields.
Mhm.
They are widely, deeply respected by their peers, their secular peers,
Mhm.
and they yet hold on to this beautiful faith, a very, an orthodox, a committed biblical view of their vocation.
Mhm.
And they can speak into our community and say, here's how there may be a redemptive approach to this topic, or maybe this is a way that Christians can engage from a perspective of faith and be additive to the
Mhm.
industry. So rather than sort of condemn this group or this topic or this technology, we say, what can we build and create that would actually be a net positive, a contribution, a social good that
Mhm.
people drawn to what Christians are building and creating and say, wow, look at those people and why are they doing this contrarian thing or this thing that seems above and beyond what maybe a pure profit motive, and then
Mhm.
invite Christians with financial resources, with social capital, with expertise, and say, how can we be part of creating something that would be valuable to in that field? And so that's AI, that's movies, that's whatever that next thing is.
Yep.
We want to have a deeper understanding of like the theology of that issue, and then what might the church or ministries that are already working in that space, how can we support them? Or if something new needs to be created, what might we design and build that can rise to the occasion?
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think that's so interesting. And Jeff, I'm glad you asked that question because um, I think it's ambitious enough to just get families together to try to communicate about these things,
Uh,
just about the big values without approaching some of these sort of hot topics in our society. And so, even more ambitious to do that. And then there was, I know you have a longstanding relationship with Praxis, and maybe you could maybe talk a little about what that relationship looks like. And then if you don't mind, maybe just kind of pull that string, maybe connect the things that we've been talking to. How do you just look at this continuum of how all of these pieces, the intergenerational, the things that are happening with media, the investment sort of space, both profit and nonprofit, maybe you can just riff on that a bit.
sure. What's fascinating is that sometimes there are generational differences in
Yeah.
what strikes our hearts as
Mhm.
worthy of God's resources, right?
Mhm.
Worthy of our attention, worthy of our family's
Mhm.
capital. And and some of these, you can frame it as disagreements. You can also frame it as a search for what you find a shared common passion, right?
Mhm.
And so sometimes, yes, we're going to talk about something that might be contentious among believers. We read the same Bible, we love the same God, and then we end up in just a very different place of like,
Yeah.
what's the right solution? What's the right diagnosis of the problem that we see? And then other times we're going to try to find something that we just enjoy together, right? There may be something that you and your daughter or your son or your grandkids like, oh, like we love watching movies or we love the outdoors or
Mhm.
there's something that you can do by spending time together.
Mhm.
Maybe the issue you may find common ground in an issue, but you may have different approaches. And the opportunity is to say, how can I learn from my grandson who
Mhm.
has a similar passion and God speaking to him in some beautiful way? I may not naturally gravitate towards that approach or that worldview, but let me understand my grandchild through his lens and see the world the way he sees it, and just be open to the possibility that God's teaching you something through your family member that you disagree with.
Mhm.
Wow. I mean, okay. The thing that comes to my mind is we have a principle at our company called empower, don't control. And I
Mm,
think even as a grandfather, I have a tendency to want to impart my wisdom to those
Mhm.
kids. And I don't think I think enough about learning from them,
Yeah.
and with the families we work with, there's a lot of people where the next gen, if you're outside of the situation, it's harder for me to do with my own family. But when you're looking at it from outside, you can tell the values are very similar or the same, but they're just expressed maybe
mm,
differently. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
yeah. It isn't okay, so this just recently came to me, so I haven't like really like unraveled all the
Yeah, yeah.
different but I was thinking about David, right? And he has this vision for how he wants to essentially steward wealth,
Right.
right? And he wants to build a temple, right?
Mhm.
He wants to build this beautiful thing to honor God, right? And God says, no, it's actually not for you to do this,
Yes.
right? And he could have said, well, I'm gonna set up this trust, and you have to follow my rules for how I want to build the temple, and you have to build it this way. And God says, no, it's going to be someone after you who's
Yeah.
going to have a different vision. And it's not going to be your vision, but you have to trust that your son is going to do this thing that's going to be beautiful and to be for the kingdom, and I'm going to be pleased, right?
Mm.
And
Mm.
wow, like I would have such a honestly, I would have such a hard time giving up that control, right?
Right.
Whether God tells me to give it up or not, I'm gonna be like, no, God, I have a better idea, right? Like, um, and so if you think about it that way, like there are things that you're going to be assigned and that are given for you to do and for you to control. And I mean, like not ultimately, but for you to do. That's your work and your calling and
Yeah.
your vocation. And have you made space to allow the next generation to
Mm,
carry forth something that you may not have the imagination for?
Mhm.
And I think that's a really hard thing to do.
man, that's amazing. Jeff Rutt, what do you think about that? I know this is your favorite topic.
Yeah, well, I think it's there's we're right in the thick of this right now. That's one of the reasons I'm connecting with some of the folks at the gathering. We want to strike that right balance of, passing on the values and the faith and the generosity theme, but allow growth and development. I'm a builder. I would have been the guy saying, no, I do know exactly how
You
that
literally
temple
have the
is going to be
plans.
built. Yeah. But I think that striking that balance of having enough direction, but allowing uh, the inspiration and the engagement
Mhm,
of Gen 2, Gen 3,
mhm,
the next generations to really flourish.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
So, Josh, also, if you don't mind, that was really good on maybe not everybody who just heard me mention the word praxis knows what that is. And maybe if they listened to our first interview with you, they might have gotten a little taste of that. But for those that didn't, maybe unpack what praxis is and what that relationship is with the gathering.
Sure. Yes. So I had the privilege of helping start Praxis with my co-founder, CEO Dave Blanchard, and the vision there was really to see how can we create this ecosystem to support and nurture and develop entrepreneurs who follow Jesus and through their venture are able to express and live out their faith, right? So that the products and services, whatever they create and put into the world, that will ultimately shape culture, actually that come from a place of I'm building this with biblical principles, with a view of how can what would it look like if it was built by a Christian? That what would it should be different. There should be a
Mhm.
distinctive flavor to it. And then it's a question of, okay, in your industry, what is that flavor and what is that distinction? And to be in community with peers who are helping you shape that, to be in community with mentors and experts who can help you think through the theology of maybe theology of construction or building or home, right? These ideas that may be somewhat abstract, but then you put a venture around it and it becomes very concrete and real and practical. And you're creating a workplace, you're hiring people, you're buying from suppliers, and you're saying this was inspired and motivated by my love for Jesus Christ. And what does that look like? And how does that look different from my peers in the industry? And so that's Praxis. And so we have a nonprofit program and a business arm and accelerator. And so where it connects to the gathering is where Praxis is identifying and supporting and developing early stage entrepreneurs in their ventures. The gathering is always on the lookout for what's on the cutting edge, what's on the bleeding edge. I say that we sit in two places. We don't want to forget the tried and true, what's highly effective and consistent and proven, right? And we want to look for excellence in those areas. So there are some really great legacy organizations and practices and methodology and leaders in that space. And then there's also like what's on the far end of what might be, what
Mhm.
ought to be, but it doesn't exist yet. And so Praxis helps us cultivate and curate our ability to see and meet those leaders.
Yeah. So you kind of combine those two a little bit. Those worlds kind of intersect a little bit
Mm,
at the gathering too, which is I think very interesting. And
mm,
I know with this kind of world that you're living in the gathering and having helped start Praxis,
mhm,
there's something about I think you've said these words, stewardship. You've said these words, creativity.
mhm,
I have a feeling you think a lot about. I always think about the Garden of Eden and how it was meant to
mhm,
be, where we commune with God and we have a job, but it's not really that much work, and we have a helper, and like it's a community, and we're just, how do you kind of think about in this sort of broken world, how we as believers try to kind of get back to that place? How do you think about that?
Oh my goodness, that's a profound question. I think there's been some theologians who are a lot smarter than I, who spent an entire lifetime trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
Like there's a part where this stewardship and doing it with family ought to be the most joyful,
Right.
fun, life-affirming, like it should be an amazing experience. And when it works well, it can just be like I'm in the flow. I can see the goodness of God in this adventure, this project of stewarding wealth wisely. And the flip side is that when it's broken, it feels so broken and
Yeah.
so hard because, gosh, it feels like this burden that money has amplified all the pain in my family, right? With relational pain or conflict or disappointment or the schism of faith when our children or grandchildren don't share our faith. And then I have I feel like something's missing, not just relationally, but the burden of trying to do stewardship well. Um, so I usually just say like start as early as possible,
Yeah.
have conversations all the time, and invite your kids and your grandkids at the earliest age to be walking alongside you, listening to you as you communicate your vision and your family values. And then as they get older, invite them to help speak into those values and what they see. You mentioned that family that shared.
Yeah.
One of the beautiful things I remember about what they spoke about is like about half their family follow Jesus, and then the other half do
Yeah.
not.
Mhm.
And they've said that they've tried to communicate with gentleness and kindness and generosity to those families that don't share their faith, but they are explicit about why we do this.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And because they've been able to be winsomely transparent, those family members that don't share their faith, they say, okay, I respect that. I respect why you are choosing those organizations to fund. And it's because you've laid out very clearly your motivations, and your motivations are consistent with how you've acted and behaved towards us and
Mhm.
how you've selected those organizations. And there is something about that model
Mhm.
that I think is worth emulating.
Yeah.
So as you invite your kids, and maybe some of them will have a little rockier a path in
Mhm.
their own faith relationship to God, that they see a consistency in our lives,
Mhm.
a consistency in the expression of those values and in what we do and how we give. And anyways, I think
No,
that
I
yeah.
think that's great, and I think most families who've experienced sort of more than enough, if you will,
Mhm.
are highly aware that it's extremely challenging
Mhm.
to. I think one of my jokes is always everybody knows money can't buy happiness, but everybody wants to find out for themselves. So uh, the
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
the I think most people know that it's difficult. Maybe as we kind of get to the end of our time, would you mind sharing just a couple of other success stories of how people maybe have overcome a challenge? Because I
Mm.
think you've probably seen so many.
Mm. Gosh, where would you know, one question I posed recently to a group of people who are wrestling with this question, right?
Yeah.
I've had to find success not in the financial markets, but actually in the relational family market.
Mhm.
Um, and one question I posed to them was to ask them, what are they willing to sacrifice or concede
Mhm.
for the goal of healthy family dynamics, right? Anyway, I first ask, what is your purpose in the family foundation or family office? What is your ultimate priority, right?
Mhm.
And so for some people, the priority is like, I actually want to optimize impact. I want to save this many lives, or right. Okay, those are good goals and good priorities,
Mhm.
and you can accomplish that. And you actually don't need your family to do that, right? If your answer includes, I want to deepen my family ties, or I want to involve second, third, fourth, seven generations in the future, if
Mhm.
that is a goal, you're going to find yourself having to ask, what do I need to sacrifice? What am I willing to concede
Mhm.
to make that happen? And I say that because um, uh, our non-negotiables probably need to be whittled down because there is a difference between a non-negotiable and a preference.
Hmm.
And as wealth creators, as first generation entrepreneurs, our tendency is to say, these are all non-negotiable, right? All these things I have decided for our family, these are all good things and they ought to be followed.
Hmm.
Well, what if this thing isn't followed? What if that thing isn't? And where are we willing to act sacrificially and generously to preserve the ultimate priority that I've set, and which is either creating a place for my family to be engaged and involved.
Hmm.
That's a hard tension to have, right? Because
Yeah.
it may involve, there are going to be some things that are like I cannot compromise on, let's say X, Y, and Z.
Hmm.
Then that's really where we get into the meat of the
Yeah.
challenges. Yeah.
That's really good. So, Josh, what I'd love, I have one more question, and Jeff, I'll turn it back to you. Josh, as you think about the gathering, and you obviously have developed, and I know, you had some predecessors that really built an amazing foundation, but you're obviously, adding your personality comes through the culture, and as you think ahead, 10 years from now. So let's say it's Halloween. We're recording this on Halloween. Say it's Halloween 2034.
Uh-huh.
And you're looking back on the last 10 years of the gathering,
Mhm.
and it
Mhm.
went amazing. It was
Mhm.
incredible. Like it was
Mhm.
almost perfect. What would
Uh-huh.
you say happened during those 10 years?
Ooh, wow. Okay. Ah, so I would, you mentioned we're recording this on Halloween. We're also recording this 1 week before the presidential elections in 2024, right? And I would say this is a moment where um, we've seen some cracks in the health of the American church, broadly speaking.
Hmm.
And if 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we still see those same pain points and pressure points of or the erosion of the church, that would be a complete failure of
Hmm.
all of us who are involved in this kind of the idea of evangelism, discipleship, loving our neighbors well. And so starting from that kind of abstract place,
Hmm.
I sort of see like today in 2024, what do we invest in and how do we give that led us to this point for the American church? What did we do 10, 20, 30 years ago in which, we have a crisis of discipleship in America. We have a crisis of thoughtful theology that's lived out in the public square in America. We have a lack of understanding of like how to love our neighbors without condemnation so there's any number of experts will say, hey, these are things that are like missing or fallen away, and like, well, how do we reverse engineer that
Hmm.
so that the church is in a much more healthy and loving and just the way that Christ meant for his bride to be. Uh,
Hmm.
so how do we like my little niche at the gathering is how do we love and serve our families, the families that are resourcing these ministries and nonprofits that are hopefully providing resource and strength and support and care for pastors and congregations and
Hmm.
who follow Jesus and people who don't
Good.
quite follow Jesus yet, but need have something that they're in a place of need.
Yeah.
So that's how I think about if the gathering could be one of the maybe the pillars of support for that
Mhm.
future, that would be ideal.
Wow. That's really good.
What a great answer. Well, as we get to the end of the time, I just want to add my thanks for to you and your team. You're always great at sharing the credit.
Yeah.
Please let them know and tell them to listen to this. And we have testimony from at least two people that it was fantastic. And I know everybody I talked to really enjoyed it. And I know I speak for Jeff with that as well. And why don't we go
And
ahead and leave it the way we normally do, Josh? We didn't kind of do your background because we normally do that, but we did that on the previous podcast with you. But let's go ahead and do kind of what we do at the end. So this is kind of a bit of a wide-ranging conversation we've had today. But I wonder what's stirring in your brain or what the Holy Spirit might bring to mind to just share for a practical tip for a family that's kind of one of your in your core demographic that you might just share with them so that they can maybe just move in the right direction here.
Hmm. Ah. Um, I really like this idea of there's a narrative in which we are participants,
Hmm.
and that's the biblical narrative, the long form, thousands of years that we get to be a blip, right?
Mm.
And so we are part of this larger conversation. And so in our however long God has for us on this earth, what story are we writing for ourselves and for our kids that someone down the road, some future Kwan, I don't know, will go back and read and say, I understand Jesus a little bit better because I see this part of Josh's life or Josh and Jane's life or Josh and Jane and Eden and Charlotte that I'm just proud to be part of this little story that is woven into this larger tapestry that God's telling throughout history. And so part of that question is where am I a part of this larger narrative?
Mhm.
And then the other question is where in this narrative can I help be a bit of an agent in writing this piece, this little piece, but it's a piece that I have some authority over and some responsibility over.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. And I think it also ties with what you were saying about what are you really trying to accomplish
Mm.
and what are you sort of willing to sacrifice? In other words, I think of that as your strategic plan. Where are we actually going?
Uh-huh.
And what do we need to do to get there and think long term? So, Josh, can't thank you enough. Jeff, do you want to say something before we leave?
Well, just thank you, Josh, for your part and leading so well with so many amazing families at the gathering. Can't wait to be a part of it again next year, and would just encourage folks to listen in, connect, and thank you for the way you're allowing God to use what He put in your hands.
Do we have time for a quick story here? Because I want to honor the two of you. Just simply to say thank you for having me on your podcast. Additionally, Jeff, you started this organization called Hope International, which you made this brilliant hire of Peter Greer, and then Jeff, you reached out to a home builder named David Weekley, and you inspired, motivated, and challenged him to give more, but also like to say, okay, what is the actual stumbling block to giving more? Because he had incredible resources, and it's to hire somebody, right? And part of the story was like, well, David, you don't personally build every home that you sell. You hire people to go, make sure it's of high enough quality that meets your name and your standard. And so the analogy was, well, if you don't meet with every single nonprofit leader, maybe you should go hire somebody to multiply your effectiveness or your productivity. And so that was the job that was created that David ended up hiring me. And that was my invitation entree into this larger world. And so you had a dramatic impact on my life.
Praise God.
If it weren't for you starting Hope International. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Josh. That's incredibly kind. And really appreciate you sharing that story. Thank you for being on the podcast today. Looking forward to connecting sometime soon.
All right. Thanks, Josh. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. Share it with a friend, subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Generous Business Owner Podcast with Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt. Make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can find the guest contact information in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode.